They looked like any other kids, laughing on playgrounds, riding their bikes through quiet streets, playing video games in bedrooms filled with toys and posters. But behind some of those smiles hid something the world could never imagine. In the heart of small-town America, where the biggest concern was curfew or homework, evil wore the face of a child. In 1993, in the small town of Savona, New York, 13-year-old Eric Smith was known as a quiet, red-haired boy. Bullied for his looks and temper, he often kept to himself. But one summer morning, that silence turned deadly. 4-year-old Derek Roby was walking just a few blocks to a summer camp when he crossed paths with Eric. Minutes later, Eric led the little boy into a secluded wooded area, and what happened next would shake America to its core. Derek's lifeless body was found later that day. The community was in disbelief. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child? The answer shattered every sense of safety. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an escaped convict. It was another child, a 13-year-old boy. When police questioned Eric, he seemed nervous but calm. And then, the words no one expected came out of his mouth. "I killed him." Investigators sat in stunned silence. There was no motive that made sense, no reason, no gain. Eric said he'd been angry at the world, angry at being bullied, and he wanted to hurt someone. As the news broke, America was horrified. Could a child truly understand what he'd done? Could a 13-year-old have a killer's mind? Psychologists called it an eruption of rage. The media called him the boy who lost his soul. But Eric Smith wasn't alone. Across the United States, more names would emerge, young killers who defied logic and innocence, each with a story darker than the last. Every killer has a story, and for some, that story begins long before the first act of violence. The question that still divides America is haunting. Are children born evil, or does the world make them that way? Experts have studied the minds of young murderers for decades, and the answer isn't simple. Some kids grow up surrounded by violence. They see it, feel it, live it. Others, on the surface, have normal lives, until one day, something inside them snaps. Take the case of Mary Bell, an 11-year-old girl from England whose crimes in 1968 shocked the world. Mary strangled 2 young boys, ages 3 and 4, and left disturbing notes at the scene. When caught, she showed little remorse. Investigators later discovered she'd been raised in a nightmare. Abuse, neglect, and trauma that no child should ever endure. Psychologists called her a victim who became a monster. But the public saw something else. A cold, remorseless child capable of evil beyond understanding. Across the Atlantic, decades later, America would face its own versions of Mary Bell. In 1999, Lionel Tate, just 12 years old, was charged with the brutal killing of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in Florida. His excuse? He said he was imitating wrestling moves he saw on TV. But the severity of Tiffany's injuries told another story, one of uncontrolled rage. Lionel was sentenced to life in prison without parole, becoming the youngest American ever given such a sentence. But soon, the nation was divided. Could a child that young truly grasp the meaning of murder? Or was he simply another product of a violent world that failed him? These cases exposed the gray area between innocence and intent, forcing courts and psychologists to rethink everything they knew about juvenile crime. Some argued these children were victims of broken homes, trauma, and exposure to violence. Others believed they were proof that evil can live even in the smallest of hearts. But one thing was clear. When a child kills, it's not just a tragedy. It's a question that shakes the very foundation of justice itself. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Monsters aren't always born in darkness. Sometimes, they're raised in it. Behind nearly every case of a child killer lies a web of pain, neglect, and fear that the world never saw coming. Society often asks, how could they do it? But the real question might be, what made them this way? Take Joshua Phillips, a quiet 14-year-old from Jacksonville, Florida. In 1998, Joshua lived in a strict household. His father was controlling, known for explosive anger. One day, Joshua was playing with 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, his neighbor and friend. Within minutes, something went horribly wrong. When Maddie didn't come home, the neighborhood searched for days, until Joshua's mother made a horrifying discovery. Behind her son's waterbed, she found Maddie's lifeless body, hidden there for a week. Joshua claimed it was an accident. He said he panicked after hitting Maddie with a baseball and feared his father's reaction. But investigators saw something darker. The brutal injuries suggested intent, not fear. The case stunned America. The smiling boy who played video games and rode his bike was now facing life in prison without parole. Psychologists describe Joshua as a child trapped between terror and immaturity. Not a cold-blooded killer, but a boy who made a deadly, irreversible mistake in a home ruled by fear. Cases like his raise a chilling truth. Children absorb what they live. In homes filled with violence, neglect, or control, empathy fades, replaced by confusion and rage. The lines between right and wrong blur when pain becomes normal. But not every young killer comes from chaos. Some, like Eric Smith, acted out of pure internal anger. Others, like Mary Bell, were molded by trauma. And then there are those who give no warning at all, whose motives remain locked deep inside their developing minds. Experts call this moral immaturity, when a child's brain cannot fully process guilt, fear, or empathy. Combine that with emotional pain, and the result can be deadly. Each of these stories reveals a disturbing reality. Killers are rarely born, they're built, one scar at a time. As the list of child murderers grew, America faced a terrifying realization. The monsters we fear the most aren't always lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, they're sitting in a classroom, smiling for a school picture. When a child kills, the courtroom becomes a battlefield. On one side, a grieving family demanding justice. On the other, a frightened, confused child who may not even understand what life in prison truly means. In America, the question isn't just, did they do it? It's what should happen to them now. For decades, courts treated young offenders as miniature adults. Judges handed out life sentences without parole, believing the punishment fit the crime. But critics asked, how can a child, whose brain is still developing, be punished like a fully grown killer? The case of Lionel Tate made history. At just 12 years old, he became the youngest American ever sentenced to life in prison for murder. The public was outraged not just by the crime but by the sentence. Could a sixth grader really understand the finality of death? In 2004, after years of protests and appeals, Lionel's life sentence was overturned. The court ruled that a child so young could not comprehend the gravity of such punishment. But by then, the message was clear: America was divided. The legal system struggled to find balance between justice and mercy. Some argued these young killers deserved severe punishment. After all, their victims were gone forever. Others insisted that a child's mind can change, that rehabilitation is possible, and that no child should die in prison. In 2005, a turning point came with the Roper versus Simmons decision, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing minors was unconstitutional. Later, in Miller versus Alabama, 2012, mandatory life without parole for juveniles was struck down, giving thousands of young inmates a second chance at life. Still, the debate rages on. For every story of redemption, there's another of relapse. A chilling reminder that forgiveness doesn't always bring peace. Families of victims say they'll never see justice if the killer walks free. Advocates for reform say children are capable of growth, healing, and change. In the middle of it all stands the justice system, forced to decide who deserves mercy and who is simply too dangerous to ever be released. In every story of a child killer, there are two lives lost: the victims and the child who took it. For the families left behind, time doesn't heal the wounds. Empty bedrooms, school photos, and fading laughter serve as reminders of futures stolen far too soon. But behind bars, the killers grow older, sometimes realizing for the first time what they've done, long after it's too late to undo it. America's obsession with killer kids has lasted for decades, not because of the horror, but because of the question it forces us to face. Can a child who kills ever truly be forgiven? Some say no. They argue that murder is murder, no matter the age. Others see these stories as tragedies born from pain, neglect, and broken systems that failed both victim and offender. Take Eric Smith, once the red-haired boy with a violent secret. After 28 years behind bars, he was finally granted parole in 2021. He spoke quietly about remorse, redemption, and a desire to help other troubled kids. But for many, forgiveness is impossible. Derek Roby's parents will never see their son again, and no apology can bring him back. Or Lionel Tate, whose story became a symbol of a justice system unsure how to punish a child. Released after serving only a few years, he later reoffended, proof, some say, that second chances don't always lead to redemption. Each of these cases leaves us torn between empathy and outrage, between the urge to punish and the hope to understand. Science tells us a child's brain is not fully developed, that impulse, judgment, and empathy are still forming. But the reality is crueler. Once a life is taken, development stops maturing. The damage is done. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't just that a child could take a life, but that society could create a world where that happens at all. From broken homes to violent media, from neglect to untreated trauma, every story of a young killer is a reflection of the world that raised them. And maybe that's the real horror, because when innocence turns evil, it doesn't just destroy one life. It questions everything we believe about childhood, justice, and humanity itself. So, the next time you hear about a killer kid, remember, behind every mugshot is a story, a warning, and a haunting reminder of just how fragile innocence really is.